Hey there! I'm Chroma, and welcome to part 20 of Making an Abstract Adventure! Welcome back! This time, we now have an NPC dialogue sort of thing, with speech bubbles, as you can see here. So, before we get into that, you can also see our environment's a bit cleaner now. So last episode, I experimented with having a, how to put this, a style with an outline, basically, as opposed to what we had before. And then now I went and actually made some better, still kind of placeholder art, but just experimenting, making some actual art. Basically, I recreated our trees with the cubes and triangles that we sort of had, and our cloud, and all that sort of stuff, except now it has a more consistent outline of what we could actually expect art in the game to look like. And yeah, it looks pretty nice. And then as well, we have our NPC models here. Those are very temporary and rough. But yeah, so now let's go into what our actual, this text thing is looking like. So starting off, I also went back to temporarily putting in our old characters in, because we're still waiting on having actual, beyond just concept art. Anyways, so if we move forward here, we have a trigger that activates this text box here. And then as you can see, we have some different things with the text there. I'm just gonna actually go back in and pause for a second. So as you can see, we have text, a text box. It sort of grew into existing, and then it kind of shrinks as it goes away, adding some, polish there. We can have text of different sizes. The actual text box itself, we can have different text boxes for different characters that talk, as we'll see. And the handle here and the rectangle itself are different things as well, so we can move that around, as we'll look at momentarily. We have different colors of text at different points of the text. And then here we also have a case where text is floating up and down by individual letters to show importance, I guess. And yeah, so we have a pretty customizable system here. Now, moving forward, we have an NPC here that if we get close to it, it has dialogue. And then this dialogue box thing is focused on that player. The other one actually followed our player, so that's pretty cool there. And then this is a case of one that can be set off multiple times. The trigger that made our player talk back here, that was a one-time event. And this one says, look out for falling boulders up ahead. The other ones had something about a key. This is just random temporary dialogue that doesn't actually mean anything for this, what we're working with here. So now we also have something interesting here with this other NPC, where we have this arrow floating above their head that when we get close to them, and this is signaling that we can interact with them. This will, well, the arrow is also a bit maybe temporary in design. It could change, or there could be like a square version of it, like this one's more blocky and then more of a rounded version, or something like that. Yeah, we could have this sort of floating arrow above everything that we can interact with. So anything we've made thus far that we can interact with, like our doors and all that, we can have this sort of floating arrow above it to more so signal that we can interact with it. And then it's also hovering and all that. So that's pretty cool. So if we go up to it and then hit our interact button, then it starts, this character starts talking as well. And then here we have like a multi-dialogue system, where then it also switches between like dialogue that's following the player and then dialogue that's following this NPC, so that we can actually have some dialogue banter going on here. And yeah, and then that was more just random dialogue about finding a key. So that is that. So now let's go in and show how all of this is working. So starting off on, the speech bubble itself, as I said before, it's just a two different images here for this, like, I don't know what you'd call that. Whatever, like the talking thing that's pointing to whoever's talking of a speech bubble, and then a rectangle of, the actual rectangle of the speech bubble itself. And then this could also be swapped out if we wanted like a rounded one, or one that's all like pointy if someone's screaming, or stuff like that. It's customizable in that fashion. So looking first at over here, this player talk test that made this first set of dialogue here. These two are the only ones that have like this experimenting with different colors and all that. This dialogue, I kind of was just typing it for the sake of testing other things, but imagine that most dialogue in the game is more vibrant like this is. Hopefully so, at least. So here we have a trigger that when we walk through it will activate this dialogue. So let's look at what the actual dialogue is here. So first, so we have the pointer sprite and the bubble sprite so the actual sprite itself, in order to have the text, it's kind of a canvas sort of thing. So how we had UI elements up here was on the canvas, so that's stuff that's rendered in front of everything else. So that's how we did our health things up here, and then these collectibles down here. Yeah, so we can also have something else called like a world canvas, where it's basically a canvas where we can have images and buttons and text and all of that, except it doesn't actually, it's not being layered on top of everything following the screen view. It's like an actual object in the scene that we can move around like any other object. So we have that here, and we've called it speech bubble. And then as child objects, we have the pointer and the bubble as as images, like with our UI elements. And then below that, we then have all the different text objects, where actually each different section of text is a different object. So here we have this hurry text that's a larger font size and is all capitals, then some more text here, and then individual letters for the key, the K, the E, and the Y, and the exclamation mark, where then these are colored blue, and then have our object hover script that we've used for many things before. That script has become very useful for making things just look nicer. Yeah, so now we have that, and then, yeah, how these actual text boxes are. Now, one, I guess, quirk sort of thing is that, yeah, if we wanted to change what this text is, we kind of are manually making each text box, but then we do get to decide like how much is in each text box. I know, I guess if we wanted to dynamically make it so that we have a certain amount of text that's being said and then sort of dividing it up amongst different text boxes, if it was a long conversation, we could make some programmed system to do that, but for our purposes here, it seems like a bit overkill, and I think getting to manually decide what goes in what text boxes works better for how we're using it here. Also, I don't think we'll be having that lengthy of conversations mid-level. Yeah, for the most part, and like even that, it still works. Like we had this case here where we had like 4 sets of dialogue things, and yeah, it's working just fine. And if we had like more lengthy cutscene thing, then we'll deal with that on its own when we get there. Anyways, so that's the speech bubble done as well. Oh, and then as well, it has this script that we'll look at in a second called grow and shrink. That is how it grows and shrinks. It goes between having a scale of all ones to having a scale of all zeros, and then it is scaling by its sort of origin point, which happens to be whatever it's following. So in this case, the player, and then down there the NPCs there. So yeah, so it's actually having this offset to scale by them. Yeah, so that's the speech bubble down. Then the being triggered to actually spawn, or not spawn, to be used, and then which specific text boxes are being activated and following players and whatnot. So yeah, so here we have this script here called talk on trigger that has first a game object reference of which player can activate it. So in cases where we have 2 characters in the same level, we might only want only when our sphere character passes this point, it'll activate dialogue for that person to say, or when only the cube character walks past this point, have dialogue for them to say. Or we might want a case where it doesn't matter, and when either character crosses this point, either one of them gets to say that dialogue, or it's not even activating player dialogue. A trigger thing could activate like an NPC saying something, for example. So how this is being dealt with here is if it's set to Cal, it'll be Cal that can set it off. If it's Q, then Q can set it off. And then if this is null, so if this doesn't have anything, like if it's none, then it'll be set off by either of them setting it off. So it's kind of a 3-way system there. Then we have a array of grow and shrink variables that is the speech bubbles themselves. Yeah, so in this case, if it's set to 1, then there's only one dialogue thing here. If I go down to our like interact talk test here for a second, wherever it was, yeah, here. So here it's set to 4 for each of the sets of dialogue things in the order that they will be shown. Back up to, actually no, I'll stay on here for a minute. So then we also then have a talk delay, which is the number of seconds between when we hit that trigger and then it actually activating the first set of text for if we wanted some delay. I don't know how often that'll be used, but just in case. Then back on, where was it? Over here, the talk trigger. Yes. So here I said it's a 0.1 just because. Then having another array, this time of floats. Yeah, of floats called talk time. That is the number of seconds that each set of dialogue is active. So if our size was set to 4 and we had 4 sets of dialogue, then we'd want this size to be the same. So it is also important that these are both the same, otherwise we'll have problems. So then this first number here would be the number of seconds, or how much time this first set of dialogue will be shown, and then it'll go to the next one and it'll wait this many seconds to show this dialogue, then this many seconds for this dialogue, and 2 to 2, then 3 to 3. Yeah, so that's how that's being done. And then lastly, we have a Boolean called one time. That's whether or not this after this trigger is set and the dialogue is set to go, whether we can activate it again if we pass through the trigger again, or whether we want to kind of get rid of the trigger after we've triggered it once. Yeah, so that's that. That's how. So then this player talk test, that was just done by using this and sending it to our Cal player, walking through it. Then we had this NPC walk by test. That's basically the same thing, except the text is instead set to 1. It can be activated by either player, and then the dialogue is set to be following this NPC. So hypothetically, if the NPC was like walking back and forth in some animation cycle, we could have the dialogue box following it, I suppose. Yeah. And then setting it to one time being false. So every time you enter this trigger, it'll reactivate the text if we want that to be a thing. And then those are basically the same. Then we have, and I believe then the speech bubble is the same as well. Then we have our NPC interact talk test that I kind of looked at just a second ago. And that is also very similar, except for the fact that it uses a different script called talk by interact, but actually all the public variables are the same. It's just the behind the scenes that's worked a bit different, but we'll look at that again momentarily as we get to it. So then here we also have basically the individual speech bubbles for each set of text. These will probably have more meaningful names instead of just being speech bubble 1, 2, and 3. We'll name things better when we are making actual dialogue for the actual game, and then there's more context to what these people are actually saying, because at the moment all this dialogue is random. Yeah, but it works for now. Not much else to say there. I guess now, one more thing with the arrow as well. So so now we have this arrow sprite here, and it's also just over in the world down here where we have our arrows and the Cal's shield. And I believe it's, down here as part of our player objects. I actually have to go make that a prefab. I'll do that, I suppose. So now we have that there. So then it has also the same grow and shrink function. Because when it appears, it grows and it shrinks. So that's that. Oh, another thing I didn't mention over with our talk trigger. So getting a reference to the dialogues, it's getting a reference to grow and shrinks. That's just for some ease of coding. I could have just gotten references to all the game objects. In fact, that's what it was initially. But because I'm going to be getting a reference to the game objects and then also getting a reference to their grow and shrink scripts anyway, I just decided to get the reference to their grow and shrinks scripts because every speech bubble will have that script on it, and then just from the grow and shrink getting the game object of it because it's easier to do it that way in code. Anyways, so that's enough of Unity. Let's go into our code and show how all this is all working together. So one small thing as well, on the follow script, I slightly changed this to use fix update instead of update, and that allowed, actually, because I forget what game object has this, but somewhere, so all the speech bubbles have this the same follow script that's on the camera, and then following either Cal or Q or whichever like NPC that's following, like so right there. So there was some sort of how do I put this? A bit of like choppiness, I guess, in how it was following the players. So by setting it to fixed update instead of update like it was before, it just was smoother basically. So that's that. Next, onto the grow and shrink function, or script of how we're growing and shrinking our the things that are being grown and shrinked. So first we have a public variable called grow speed. That's self-explanatory enough. Then a hidden inspector, but public boolean called growing, that if it's set to true, then we're growing to be at all ones, or the scale being at all ones. And then if it's set to false, then we're shrinking to have a scale of 0. I suppose I could also have another variable here of what it's growing to, of if we're growing to a size of all ones, or if we're growing to a size of all twos, or however big. But so far I haven't come across, We'll do that if we come across a situation where we need to use the script and make an object grow to something bigger than just 1. But yeah, so that's fine for now. So then on start, we're setting the scale to 0. Also, for some reason, with the way that Unity treats scales, we have to get the local scale, which for an object that's basically on the parent level, and actually the thing on the parent level is set to all 1s, it's gonna be basically the same as getting the global scale. But the global scale, which isn't actually a thing, if you type scale, you only have local scale or lossy scale, but this is set to get only, so you can't actually modify that. But anyways, that's, yeah, just what we have to do. Get the local scale, which is going to be basically the same under these circumstances, and then setting it to 0 so our object starts all small. And again, if we had a situation where we didn't want this, then we can make that happen. So then down here, if growing is true, then we are slowly using vector3.move towards to make the object grow towards being all 1s. This is very similar to the linear interpolation functions we used before, actually just like the follow script does. Or no, that uses smooth dampening, never mind. But we have some scripts somewhere that use .lerp. Now move towards buzz, basically the same thing, except it's at a more constant speed. So then we're going from our current scale to a scale all 1s by the growth speed, then times time.delta time, so that if we pause the game, then it'll stop growing. Then otherwise, if growing is set to false, then we're doing the same thing, but we're going to 0. And then another thing, just to help with cleanup, I guess. So if the distance of that, if the distance of the if the object scaling down towards 0 is basically close enough to being 0, then we're just making sure it's exactly 0 so that it's hidden and not like barely visible, but very small. So that's that. Then next onto the talk on trigger script. So that's the main chunk of now how all this dialogue stuff is working in terms of activating text by walking through a trigger. And then as you'll see, the talk by interact is going to be very similar, but we'll cover this one first. So first we have, actually we basically covered all these public variables, so we can just skip on by that. Then we have a private Boolean called activated. That's whether or not this has been activated, because we don't want to kind of be activating it multiple times at once, basically. So then, so on the start, like as soon as we start the game, all of the text bubbles that are in the scene, we want to set all of them to false, just so that they aren't active when we don't want them to be. So yeah. Then down here we have an on trigger enter function. We've covered this before as well with things like our interact script. So if we've entered the trigger collider of something that that has a trigger collider on it, then running this function here. So first we're testing if this has not already been activated. This has to do with the one-time stuff, and also making sure not activate something before we want to, like if it's already running, basically. So then if that is not the case, then we want to test stuff with our player to trigger stuff. So we want to test, so if player to trigger has a value, this will be true if it has a value, and if it's null, then it'll be false. So if it has a value, meaning it's one of the players, and the thing that we've collided with is the player that we want to collide with this to set off the trigger, then we'll be running all of this down here. Or if player to trigger is false, meaning either player can activate this, and we collided with something that has the tag player, so it's one of our players, then we're running all this down here. So doing that, first we're setting activated to true, so then we're not running this more than once when we don't want to be. Then we're setting the layer to 0. This is taking so everything that we can interact with is on the interact layer. Actually, this this doesn't need to be here, because this was something I did in the talk by interact that actually has nothing to do with here. So I can actually remove that, and that won't be a problem. So anyway, so we'll cover what that was over in the talk by interact. So anyways, then we now want to activate our text, because we are now entering this trigger, but we're starting that by first just disabling any bubbles that might be active again, in case we have a scenario where this is in the middle of playing text, and then we like multiple dialogues, and then we activate it again for some reason, just making sure to fully reset it and not leave on like the third dialogue in a set or something that's like still on, and then starting with the first one and then having overlap with text boxes. Yeah, so we're disabling every text bubble again, just to be on the safe side. And then as well, stopping all coroutines, and then running this coroutine down here, just because this is going to be dealing with delays and stuff. So just making sure that everything is reset as we want it to be. Yes. So then we are first waiting our talk delay to have this sort of initial delay before starting it, if we wanted that for whatever reason. Then going through everything in every piece of dialogue, which you'll notice here we used a for each loop, and here we're using just a normal for loop. We'll get into that in a minute. So here, yeah, we're just going through each dialogue and just setting it to false. Here, we actually want what I is for down here with talk time, because these are two arrays that are sort of linked more or less in just the way that we're using them. There's probably potentially a better way to do this, but again, trying to keep things simple enough for, yeah, showing off these, like how I'm doing things and all of that. And again, there's some things where we don't really need to go that overkill. It works. It's fine. So then starting off here with activating our pieces of dialogue. First, we're making sure that this thing's dialogue is 0, and then setting its dot growing thing to true, because again, that's getting a reference to its grow and shrink script, setting its growing thing to true so that it'll start scaling up. And then setting its active state to true, because we set it to false up here. We want it to actually be active, but then start having scale of 0. You'll notice there is a kind of a decent amount of like some repeating of doing some things. That is just to make sure everything works, and if there are bugs somewhere, that there's hopefully some kind of basically like fail safes to make sure everything doesn't break if like one thing breaks. So that's what most of that is. Then so then after setting the thing to being active, that'll also start the follow script that's on it, so it'll start following whatever it needs to be following. Now our text will rise up and exist. Then we are then waiting the required talk time of how long approximately the text will be, which again is dependent on how much text there is, basically. Yeah, then setting the dot growing to false, so then it'll shrink back down. Yeah, and then this doesn't actually need to be here. This should be outside of the loop. So there's that. Okay, so then we're repeating everything for the number of pieces of dialogue that there is. And then after that, now that we're done all the pieces of dialogue, then we are seeing if one time is true, then we are disabling the script, or this object, which would then also disable the script, and also the trigger itself, so that we can't trigger it again. Otherwise, then we're setting activated to false, so that we can activate everything again if we re-enter the trigger. So that's that. Now, going over to talk by interact, you'll notice a lot of things are the same, and actually some of the changes I made here I'll probably have to make here, I believe. Or no, I didn't write this time. Okay. But yeah, so that's that. So starting off here, we have basically everything's the same, except we don't have this player to trigger thing, because as we'll get to in a moment, it is the player interact script that activates this here. Actually, we can look at this first, because it'll be then easier to show why things are different over in the talk by interact script. So down here, like we had before, with testing. So first, if we've interacted with something that we can interact with, then actually I've also noticed I've rearranged some of my if statement stuff, but then kind of moved things around, so I didn't really need to do that anymore. So these can be combined again, but I'll do that later. So yeah, so first of all, if we can interact with something and we've interacted with something that's on we've entered the collider of a trigger that's on layer 12, that's our interact layer, and then if we've hit the O key, then going through all that list of things that we could be interacting with, and then running the required scripts that we need to. So if we've entered the collider of something called talk, then we are getting the component talk by interact on that script, and then running a function called activate that we'll be looking at, like that we'll see in just a second, and then setting the interact arrow, which by this point would be like raised. We're setting its dot growing to false. So then with that interact arrow, we are getting a reference to it now with the player interact script. And then at the start of the game, we're setting dot growing to false, so it'll be scaled down to 0. Yeah, and then if we enter the collider of something we can interact with, then we're setting this to true. Yeah, not doing that in state. The reason yeah, these are separated but could be put together in an and was because initially I had all this like right here, so that no matter what we were interacting with, like even if we haven't hit dot key down, we would have the arrow showing. But I decided to be a bit more optimized and just have it on the enter part of the script because that's all where it needs to be. Anyways, so then down here we have the opposite, more or less. So then if we exit the collider of something that's on the interact layer, then we're making it not grow. And then you'll see here that we kind of have this twice. And well, actually that's because of this will run if we exit the collider. This will run when we actually have done the interacting. We want the arrow to go away while we're interacting with whatever it is that we're interacting with. So there's that. Now, that's all said and done. Now looking into this activate script, or this activate function on this script over here. So this basically works pretty much the same as what was in the onTrigger enter function here, except instead it's a function that's just being called. So when we call this, we first test if this thing isn't already activated, just making sure that, again, it's not running like multiple times, then setting activated to true if we're interacting with it, then setting this game object to be on layer 0 so that the arrow, so basically so that we can't, to deal with the arrow, because otherwise we'd still be in the collider of something that we can interact with if we exit and re-enter the trigger while all this dialogue is playing. So we don't want the arrow to reappear while all the dialogue is playing, and we haven't actually disabled this yet if one time is false. Now, the alternative to this could potentially be getting a reference to the collider. So for instance, on most of these here, this one uses a square collider, this one uses a sphere collider here. So we could like get a reference to this, just the collider, and then disable it. Then we wouldn't be able to interact with it. However, we don't necessarily know what collider could be on this. We could have a circle collider, a box collider, I think there was a cylinder collider, and stuff like that. So we want to basically not have to see which collider we have and disable that. This is just a way of getting around not having to know which collider is that we're using for that. So then we're going through each bubble in the dialogue, setting it to false as we did before, stopping all the coroutines, and then starting this wait to talk enumerator. Then doing basically the same thing. I don't think anything's really different here, other than after activating all of the dialogue and then waiting and then activating the next one and all that, then we're setting this game object's layer back to 12, which is that interact layer, so that we could interact with it again if we need to. Then if one time is true, then we're setting this to false. Otherwise, then we're setting activated to false, so then we can interact with this again. So that is that. Yeah, so that covers all of that with some other minor changes that I made there. And yeah, now we have text, and it actually looks quite good, especially with just a lot of the minor things, like having it grow into place, the things that we're doing with the text, like having some letters like hover up and down and stuff like that. Oh no, did I break something? Okay, so something broke while I was going through this. I'll have to look back at what that was. Yeah, probably just, oh well, if that's like, it was working at one point, I can get it working again. So anyway, so that is that. But yeah, a lot of these minor things that are making our game look more polished. And also now we have things like the black outlines around our environmental things that make things look more nice and clean, and also more consistent with being the same size. But anyways, so that'll do it for this episode. It could be a while for the next one, because I think the next thing I'll be working on is a lot of art improvements. Not necessarily with our environment. It looks good enough for now, although it is still very placeholder-y. Next, I want to start working on stuff with the player. So yeah, so going back to these concept art and then making them reality, I guess. I'm thinking I'm gonna be going for not necessarily a sprite sheet animation style, maybe a bit of that, but going more for like making the player like this, but then having like everything like the eyes, mouth, eyebrows, arms, and all that being on different layers, and then being able to animate them in Unity to have them move around. I also want to have a lot of like sort of like squash and stretch with moving around and like jumping and falling and all of that. So look forward to that, a bit of jelly movement, sort of. And yeah, we'll see how that goes from there. And yeah, as always, also I have a Discord. You can go to that and meet other game development people, and also see some more behind the scenes of like what I'm doing in between episodes and what other sort of things I'm making. And yeah, so that's enough rambling for me. I feel like I have something else to say, but I'm forgetting it right now. Maybe. Oh yeah, so also making new art, but then also doing animation stuff as well as what I want to do, which means also potentially then animating things like this, like the sword slash and this like pipe staff thing, that swing, which means then we'll also finally do stuff with over on our players, this attack hitbox that was all temporary, making that an actual animation that's swinging that. Yeah, and then once we actually have better animations, then we can start, I feel we can start doing more things with having the way that our players interact with the world. Because, for example, one thing that I wanted to potentially make is maybe ladders, but to do that, I would like to actually have the players with having their hands existing to potentially animate walking or climbing up a ladder, and then however I'd animate hands to match up with the individual things of a ladder. And then also potentially, in terms of things we can interact with, having something like a lever where there's a little animation of them like grabbing the lever and then like pulling it to the other side to do something. So there's a lot of things like that I want to wait until we actually have the players existing how they should in terms of a sense of scale, stuff like that, actually having hands to grab things with. And then, yeah, we'll be going on from there and starting to actually plan whatever this finalized demo of this game is going to look like, and then going from there, start building things actually towards that demo, and yeah, expanding from there. Still haven't decided what the setting of that demo is going to be. I don't know if it'll be this like foresty style, or if I might try to, I have an idea of what all the levels in the game are going to be, but I don't know what necessarily this demo is going to be for ease of making enough for this demo. It'll probably be of one of the art styles of what will be one of those levels, but maybe not as detailed as when we eventually are making those levels and are making a lot more detailed art things. Anyways, again, enough rambling from me for now. So anyways, that'll do it for this episode. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, I'll see you around.